Hello, my name is Gian Hernandez. I am a PhD student in intercultural communication at the Università della Svizzera Italiana in Lugano, Switzerland. I'm presenting a paper entitled Not Our Students, Race and Nationality in Swiss Universities. The title itself comes from an interview that I conducted with an administrator who was very clear in delineating who is one of our students and who is not, so who belongs and who doesn't. And I found it very evocative of the ways in which race and nationality kind of intermingle with one another and how this sort of inclusion and exclusion dynamic really works. To give an introduction to the paper, I was interested in student experience at Swiss universities, so I conducted 22 qualitative interviews with international and domestic students, as well as with 5 administrators from the 3 linguistic regions of Switzerland, so the French, the Swiss German, and the Italian-speaking regions. And this is a second paper of my cumulative PhD dissertation, or dissertation by publication. I'm hoping to have it published in a special issue on critical issues of internationalization. So to give a little bit of context about internationalization, so the research on internationalization tends to not so much engage in race and ethnicity research, and when it does, it focuses on sort of U.S. American experiences, looking at race through a U.S. American framework, adopting a U.S. American lens, etc. One thing that we often see is kind of the experiences of racialized students coming to the United States, or conversely, racialized students from the United States going elsewhere, and kind of seeing those cultural contingencies. One thing that I would like to contribute with my work is looking at the ways in which theory kind of applies in the Swiss context, and also kind of looking at how race and ethnicity can be thought differently. So I think that this is where I'm going to slot my contribution. One way that I was interested in looking at race and ethnicity, specifically when it comes to embodiment and kind of emotions, was affect theory. And I'll get into it a little bit later in the presentation as to why this is going to be interesting. But I think it's an innovative approach in terms of looking at race and ethnicity. So just an overview of the concepts that I'm going to be using. So this is a very basic definition of international student. They have to have crossed a national or territorial border and be enrolled outside of their country of origin. That being said, one must also remember that the international student as a category is culturally contingent. And so, especially when it comes to different contexts, different ways of conceptualizing international, especially with the topic of this paper, I think it's very important to kind of understand that this idea is always dynamic and it's sort of changing depending upon whom you ask. Specifically, when it comes to different conceptualizations, I wanted to go with a very clear idea of what I'm talking about when I talk about race. So I'm going with David Theo Goldberg's definition of race, which is taken historically, as in having a historically informed background, as or in terms of identifying people geomorphically by their supposed phenotypes. So really this visual aspect, kind of moving through race as a both semiotic endeavor, meaning meaning making, but also kind of associating those meanings with physical geographic origins, right? So he talks about identifying them in terms of their imputed or implied geographic origin and the cultural characteristics considered to be associated with those geographic identifications. And so this idea that there is a discursive and a material aspect to race, which is present throughout Goldberg's work, is really of utmost importance for me when I talk about race. When discussing nationality, I think it's interesting, particularly in internationalization research, that this idea has been boiled down to kind of its common sense understanding. Often we'll see nationality being commonsensically understood as your ownership of a passport. But drawing on a communications scholar by the name of Cross Wiley, nationality is actually a powerful logic of spatial and social organization. It means that nationality is not necessarily just where you have a passport, but is also kind of comprised of historical forces, the ways that meaning making is understood in your context, and it ties back also kind of similarly to this idea of race. It becomes a shorthand for particular political experiences and is therefore kind of interwoven with ideas of culture, with ideas of race, with ideas of ethnicity, with ideas of gender. And so this articulation, this coming together of these sorts of things constitutes nationality, and I think is a much more theoretically enriching way of discussing it. So for me, what I found, what I want to talk about, especially when it comes to race and ethnicity and nationality, is this idea of affect and embodiment and the ways these two concepts interact with one another. So I'm going with affect, understanding that one cannot talk about affect without talking about the body, and one cannot talk about the body without talking about affect. So we see with this definition, embodied meaning making, affect as embodied meaning making, is dependent upon specific practices that converge to create specific constellations of behaviors, psychological processes, feelings, narratives, and other discursive and material constructs. Here again, the discursive and material interwoven are of utmost importance. That being said, the idea that affect is ever present is also kind of the idea that I'm going with when I talk about the body, when I talk about how race is embodied, how nationality is embodied. One cannot think about it without imagining the process of the affective processes, these feelings, these narratives. And so this definition from Blackman is also quite appropriate, because she says that the body is constructed based on its capacity to affect and be affected, right? So this idea that these two in juxtaposition are working upon one another is also quite theoretically motivating. Thinking through these theories brings us to the idea of methodologies and methods. So when thinking about the sort of theoretical motivator of affect theory, I'm wanting to think about the interviews that I've conducted as affective situated encounters, which means that the relationships between interviewer and interlocutor, it's dynamic. It's always shaped by these different relational intensities, by the affect, by the ways in which the body and affect interact. And so this is sort of a methodological concern, right? So I'm interested in drawing not only the text from the interview transcripts, but also the place, like the way that the interaction is structured through affect, the way that the interview is constructed, how it came to be. And so I think that this is an innovative approach, simply because oftentimes the way that we approach interview texts is quite dogmatic. And I think that it's important to understand that these texts are merely tools for us to get at the more theoretically underpinned ways of thinking. Moving from the sort of methodological concern to the methods concern, the nuts and bolts really. I'm interested in this, like looking at the texts, but also being concerned with the teller. As well as the tale. So this idea from narrative analysis, kind of drawing on literary studies, is important because the stories that emerge from these interview texts are fascinating, and it's very interesting to kind of get into how these narratives are constructed and what those narratives mean, getting back to the kind of more theoretical aspects that I discussed in previous slides. And really getting down to the nitty-gritty fine details, I'm looking at the lexical, syntactic, and prosodic levels to explore emotional expressions. This means, you know, the word order, the word choice, and then also kind of the outside of those levels. So the prosodic meaning automatopoeia and gesture and that sort of thing. So that's what I'm looking at when I get to the analysis. And now, for some preliminary findings, and granted these are very, very bare bones. I've gone through all of my interviews at a sort of open coding level, given them an overview, but I'm hoping to refine the codes and move forward. So I'm very, very interested in what impressions these upcoming slides make, just because I'm interested in seeing how these findings kind of resonate. Within the theoretical framework that I've set up, the interview itself is a situated affective encounter, as I said before, which means that affect is ever present. It's not only present in the text, but also in the analysis, which presents some difficulties, right? Because how do I get at affect in this sort of embodied meaning-making sense if it's, as affect scholars say, precognitive, right? Which means outside of language. How do I get at something that's outside of language using language? And so that's one of the reasons why I chose this narrative idea, simply because these stories, they kind of impact both me as an interviewer, but then also the audience of the scientific journal that I'm trying to write for. And so I think that drawing this connection is going to be very important. But it's difficult, which is why I entitled this subsection sort of difficult embodiment, kind of drawing back on this idea of difficult knowledge in another context. Um, so one thing that I noticed within the data is that there is this sense of embodiment, and this is something that isn't necessarily acknowledged in internationalization research. This contribution from one of my interview subjects, she stated that sometimes when I'm feeling I don't have any friends here at all, I do feel in my body that sometimes I will be like, I don't feel like waking up. And I found this really, really impactful. For me, this was, it drew on sort of this idea of being international, not feeling feeling isolated, kind of the way that affect has structured her way of being in this space. And so it was very impactful, and I kind of wanted to get at that in terms of my analysis. But when talking about affect and emotion, I think there is often a focus mostly on the traumatic or negative or violent experiences, and this is something that we see in emotion research quite often. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the positive or ways that emotion can be freeing. So the second contribution from one of my interview one of my interview contributors is that she felt as though that she was calm. It just the burdens were lifted, and so I think that this is informed also by their way of being in sort of the international space. So I think I want to play with this idea of difficult embodiment as I move further in the analysis. Gesture was really important, and it was a way that I think that I'm going to be able to get at an affect, simply because when a student says, this is this feeling of excitement, I was interested in this feeling of excitement that she specifically had with their friend from the Congo, was that, what does it feel like? And she says, I was trying to say, okay, and she makes this excited flailing hand gesture. Where should I start? And the feeling is, where should I start? She was like, well, yeah, where should I start? It's a happy feeling, obviously, but trying to ask questions, you say, okay, and she makes this gesture, like if you have a lot of questions and you would love to ask, so yes. And this is something that I was noticing how students are expressing themselves. The gestures and these onomatopoeias and these sort of precognitive, like sort of extra linguistic ways of expression really kind of influenced and informed the ways that affect is manifesting in these encounters. And so I thought it was really important to get at how they're expressing themselves and how affect is structuring without necessarily moving back to the sort of dogmatic way that texts, this sort of logocentric approach to analysis. I really want to play with that idea as well when talking about the ways in which internationalization experiences are structured. And then, of course, when moving from the kind of overall embodiment ideas to more specific ways things are embodied, I wanted it goes without saying that race played a huge role in the ways that people are embodied. And so I think that those expressions of embodiment, they align with these macro context ideas of difference, of dynamics of difference. And this is, I think, where the study realizes its value and becomes very specific. And so I was thinking about whiteness as a shield, a way that my students, the interview participants were shielded from specific ideas of what race might look like and how they might shield themselves. So it was a shield in that it kind of prevented them from being exposed to certain things, but it was also heavy, meaning they couldn't necessarily move with any sort of flexibility or dexterity. And so one of my interview partners said, if I don't say a word, you wouldn't know if she was Swiss or not, right? She said, if I don't say a word, not, because I guess I could be Swiss if you look at me. And I thought that this was an interesting way that internationality manifested in itself, because she's clearly not Swiss when you speak to her, but then looking at her whiteness really managed to cement her in this context. And so it was a way that she would be shielded from some forms of discrimination, but not all forms. And so I thought this was quite interesting. And then there was another impactful interaction in which a student encountered a neo-Nazi. And so he mentioned that he was part Jewish, and And he did not mention this to the man because he was clearly anti-Semitic, but he was more shocking or surprising. And so he did not try and confront him about it. And I thought that this was interesting, particularly in the European context where Jewish identity isn't necessarily subsumed into whiteness. But nevertheless, this person was white passing. And so in that sense, it was kind of a very prevalent and very apparent means of protection. Because had this neo-Nazi known that this person was Jewish, I'm certain that the interaction would have gone very differently. And I think that the affective dynamic there is really to be noted. And something that I don't think is necessarily talked about when we talk about internationalization and specific and also race, right? Because this way of embodiment, the way that this person physically is interpreted, is influenced by the way that his body looks. But then there is again that feedback loop between affect and embodiment that I think is really important to consider. So that's a very rough overview of what I'm going to be talking about. For the next steps, I'd like to refine codes and continue with analysis, and then move towards a submission deadline, which is August 31st. So thank you very much for watching this presentation, and I look forward to discussing with you soon.